So these are the steps. Let me see hands go up when you've gotten the lesson 1 stuff already checked out, particularly if you have it running. I guess I could have included the step of after you've done all that, you can do like NPM start just to make sure that it's running. But once you get there, just put your hand up for a few seconds or something.
Oh, you were supposed to just clone it into your, where are you working at? Working on it at? Where's your terminal?
Or if anybody's stuck, feel free to ask for help.
So you need to get.
We've got several people here today who can help out as well. So.
Oh, okay. You need to set up a workspace. You want to set up a.
Okay.
Do a Cloud9.
Yeah, Cloud9 is the best. Do you have a Cloud9 environment? Did you get an invite for setting up a Cloud9 workspace? Do you know? If you haven't set that up yet, we'll have a couple other steps that we need to do as well. Because in Cloud9, we'll need to use.
Interesting. What is the checkout? I'm familiar with using that for branches.
Yeah, this is a tag.
Yeah.
So I debated between using branches or using tags. Tags are just basically a way to name a commit. So all I did was just name the commit. So I'll be doing that off of my master branch, and then that way it'll be easy for people to check out that tag and work off of it. We haven't done a lot of, like in this class in particular, we haven't talked as much about Git branching and some of the other stuff. So I'm trying to keep it relatively simple. It'll tell you you're probably in detached head state, which is fine. Okay, you might need to run npm install. All right. Let's check this out. This always happens, right? This is the problem with complex development environments. This is why it's so hard. This is why so many places use very controlled things to teach programming. React scripts not found. All right, you have the same problem. So everyone, I'll go ahead and add a couple more steps up here just to make sure that everyone's there. Hopefully this will be enough. Let me throw them over here. So hopefully that'll be enough to get you there after the npm install. I'm hoping npm start should work.
Are you on Cloud9?
Ooh, I forgot to ask. While we're working on this, who did pull down that, since I don't have a way to have you guys submit stuff through it yet, who pulled down that workshop, the React workshop that we were working on last class and worked through the examples? A decent number. Did anybody try to work through them or try to pull it down but get stuck, wasn't able to make it through them? You made it through them? You got stuck?
Should we use
Okay.
The blank template or the
blank is probably the easiest one to start with.
You can give it a name. You need lowercase and it's that either dash it or for your
This is the same thing over here just to make sure that it's going to work.
No, you can use the same one. We're going to do blank.
This will take a while. Ooh, I don't want to forget my charger. Yeah, if anybody is interested in keeping files that they've changed themselves, I can give a quick walkthrough of how to do that. But
C is how you go into a folder. Or you can, CD is to like go up, supposed to buy the right thing.
it takes a little while to do this first one. What's that?
So it's within your workspace.
Yeah, it's going to take a while.
In this case, we did the Git clones, we added a folder for the app Stopwatch using pulling the code.
So we got this stuff out a little earlier, but I pretty much haven't touched the computers till this morning when I went to work since I left class on Tuesday. Yeah, walked out on the 4th of July, packed up my house and everything so I could travel, went and visit family down in South Texas, got back. Yeah. My parents have been in the same house for I think 15 years, still have boxes. Still have boxes. Isn't that scary? How does that happen? I don't know. Has anybody got there yet? NPM install is taking a long time. All right, I think this one got, let me try it now. Come on, you can do it. All right. I got mine up and running. Oh, thanks for posting that, Crystal.
What is the first part though? I don't think I did it.
That NVM. What's that? The NVM instructions?
Yeah, but what do we do when you first set up the workspace?
Yeah, that's just these NVM steps that you have. So what that's doing is just installing a newer version of Node. It's a lot like Ruby version manager.
Oh yes.
It's the exact same thing.
My brain is like.
That's why it's called that. It's mirrored off of Ruby version manager, and
I remember us talking about that in the class.
yeah.
My brain has forgotten.
For some reason, they just don't have the latest on there by default, but this project requires it, so we have to update.
I do remember us doing that, but I couldn't remember if we did something before we did that.
We did have some things that we had to do before that, but that was for the other projects that I worked on, so we don't need to make those changes here.
Oh. Are you installed?
So those are always the steps when you clone a file and then open it up.
When you clone? Well, yeah, if you're cloning a JavaScript repository, this will probably be the steps. You don't necessarily have to do this git pull, I guess, because if you just cloned it, you'll have the latest. I could actually get rid of that. But most of these, like you clone, go into your folder. This is not always a step. That's a step just here because I'm getting everyone on the same tag so that everyone's code will be the same state. I mean, it will be right now anyways because I've only committed that one commit, so that's what they would have. But next, like starting next class after everything we work on, then I'll have people check out lesson 2. And that way, no matter where they were, we'll start at the same point in time. And they won't be, they may have some challenges with what they missed in terms of concepts, but they'll have the same code state. Has anybody got this running yet?
How do you,
yeah. All right, we got a few.
How do you install npx?
You're probably fine without npx.
Okay, so you don't need it for this one?
Yeah. You don't need it because it's going to install the React scripts. We're cloning a project and we're not starting our new project ourselves.
Okay, so like, I guess run through the rest of that right there. Git clone and stuff. It should be, you can copy it from Slack. Clone the file from GitHub.
All right. So we're getting there, right? Do people still need these instructions up here? No? All right.
And now you're just gonna go to the name.
I might be giving too much away.
Is that folder and yeah, to just make sure it's to date. That pulls from the original. Okay, and then you're gonna check out the tag. What is it called? Check out lesson. Oh, one, there's no space. Alright. Let's see if you can do, npm install.
It should be what you have pretty much when you get everything up and running.
No, you didn't.
So who isn't there yet? Who's still working to get to this up and running?
It's gonna be lost.
Anybody? Other than. All right. Here's what I want us to do today, and we'll break this down into different blocks, sort of working through this as if we're working through. I'll have you guys tackle stuff, but what I really want to see is you guys split up into groups. It doesn't have to be the same group the whole time. Probably makes sense if it is, but split up into groups, 2 or 3 people, more if you want. And basically, what I'm going to start with is I'm going to give you a very basic, very high level feature request, which is going to just have a few. This would be a lot like what you would get if you were actually working on something a lot of times at a company. Like you might get a feature request similar to this. And the first step is I want each group to not start writing any code, but try and break down what are the bits that you would need to write or the things that you would need to fulfill this feature, right? And think like, okay, what are the components I need, or what are my UI, sort of whatever language you want. But the best thing is to try and think in terms of components and what you need to accomplish the feature. And then the rest of the class will be sort of building on top of that. We'll come to a common understanding of how we want to break it down, and we'll sort of split off and start building out those features. And we may not finish this whole thing this class. It may be something where you can keep working on it between now and the next class to work towards getting all that in. But it's not a huge project, I don't think. So what I wanted us to try to go with for today is your feature is I want to add a stopwatch component to our app. And yeah, there's a lot to this. So we may not make it through all of this today. We might only get through maybe the very first part. But what I think we definitely can get through is breaking it down and then probably getting at least one of these like sort of components implemented. And I'll indicate there's probably more than one component here that we're looking at building out. The requirements for this feature level. So this is literally, this looks almost identical to the type of spec or feature you might get if you were working on a project at a company a lot of times. So we want to add a stopwatch component. The stopwatch will show the elapsed time in minutes, seconds, and milliseconds since it was started. And then we need a way to start the stopwatch a way to stop the stopwatch, and a way to clear or reset the stopwatch. Let's say you've been given those as sort of your requirements of a new feature that we want. So I'll leave this up. This is just going to stay up for the whole time that you guys are working on this, at least right now. But let's have people break up into groups. If you're watching this remotely, you can just post stuff in Slack if you want as you're thinking through it. But break up into groups and try and break this down. Think about what components you would need for this. And maybe the easiest way is you might, if you have paper or you want to go to a whiteboard or something, you might sketch out what the UI might look like. And that might help you think about the components. Because if you remember, we did that how to break stuff down into components practice. That's sort of the starting point here, is break it down into what you think the components would be. And let's give, I don't know how much time I should give for this. How much time do you guys think you want? 5 minutes, 10 minutes? To try and break this down into components? 10 minutes? Let's give 10 minutes. So at 7:20, we're going to try and come back together and talk about what you guys have for components, what you're thinking about how to put this stuff together. I'm so tired. Oh, I get really tired. I have to, I don't always, but I do much better when I do something like a run, something lunch, the afternoons. I've also learned very lightly. Otherwise, my afternoons, you would come to me and like, hey, let's work on this problem. And I'd be like, you're talking too fast. Talk to stuff with if you want. You don't want that. Do you want to talk to us after that? Yeah, we wouldn't be like people. You're gonna make her a cake? You're gonna make her a carrot cake. What's up? They're all super. You ever heard about my yellow cake plans? I'm gonna figure out how to make these. I want to make a cake. You know, sometimes carrot cakes look like carrots. I want to make one that looks like that, and then you cut into it. It's like a chocolate cake inside, and you eat it. It's just like a yellow cake. And then I want to get some white carrot. You know, like the whitest carrot I can possibly find. You know, some of them exist. Yes. Yes. And then shred that up. And make a German chocolate cake. It's really a carrot cake. It's really a carrot cake. It's gonna look like a German chocolate cake, but it's not. Oh yeah. Oh yeah. My wife and I have to. I didn't get sent. We got a seed bar. I never get sent anything off anymore. Ever since I went to Brad years and years ago, I don't get sent stuff. It's sad. And then my wife and I actually want to make like a pie. What? Yeah. right? But it's like pie thing, and then like flip it over, you know. So and then like get like butter and some greens and stuff and coat the outside, so it's like a pie, you know, like a shepherd's pie or something.
Oh, wow, yes.
Like a savory pie. That's not cool. That's awesome. Anyways, sorry.
So, actually, I'm doing it.
Change this to. Oh, yeah.
That part would be.
It's gonna be used as more like maze and calls
Sure.
Yeah.
Actually, we don't use it.
Are you hosting it on GitHub?
Like if it's two different buttons, does that make it more complicated?
I think we'll. So,
Yeah.
so like.
Oh, that's true. Versus having two separate.
We don't have that right there. So when we stop.
You go into.
Oh, I didn't know. I'm not sure how you do that. That's a good
Did you forget to include the
thing.
missing the NPM package? Go up to
The function is gonna do this.
the NPM or package that JSON file in there.
Maybe that would
Check
be
it
state.
out, start this.
There would be state, stop, start.
Yeah.
I don't think it was.
People use
Start,
gauge.
Zero. Maybe it's maybe you need to go into the React suite. Okay. Okay. I was like, there we go. Yeah. Oh, it's another level up.
Because we have to like.
This is one thing a while back. First class, and it's really.
That's in this, I mean, I see it in this.
A reset. You could just unveil it and then drop it again. Yeah, figure it out.
I'm not even very slow. You'd think that knowing that people do this all the time, I have some sort of like NPM clone or something.
Like clear and then we can do. I don't know if this is right, but I think we should use now. And then
Wow, that's awesome.
Yeah, so this off here.
Oh, there's nothing, that's just what I just made the ideas from that.
I'm not sure if this is right. Or somehow you could set the same which would be pretty easy. And it would be like
This is insane.
Trying to pass stuff down. Cool.
Yeah.
I think it's really cool. I haven't gone and looked at it. I mean, it's definitely a very large project, so I'm not really challenged by it, but I think that's fine. Right?
Especially if they know.
Yeah, and I think getting people, I think it's a good idea to give them something that's, or I haven't, that's the hard part for me, is gauging how long
When
it's
you
gonna
create
take, right?
a
Like when I
bunch of digs,
I
right?
did like the little sample stuff for the ones I gave you. It's like, you know, hey, I'm gonna do this.
When you create a bunch of
Somebody else,
digs,
you
they don't
know,
have anything.
take 3 hours, 4 hours. Right, it easily could be, it could just be stuff, but it's hard to gauge. So I think giving them something large as is, you know, quite a great. Plus it gives an opportunity to talk about, because one of the things that they discussed with
One of
it
the
was
easiest ones
more example code, see more example code. And so this is a much larger set of examples for somebody to look at. So they'll be able to, right. That's been one of my goals. You know, it's weird how long it takes to write small things, because I'm like, if I write something larger, it's not that bad. And I'm trying to do something that's very focused. I'm like, okay, my goal is to create a very focused, like I want to teach one concept of this, a little bit of code. I'm gonna write this, so I'm focusing on this concept and not like all these other peripheral things, so that that's what I'm able I think that looks really cool. I think it would be a great project.
Okay.
Thursday? Friday? Yeah, either way. All right. How are people doing? You still figuring out how you want to break it out? You guys ready to talk about how we would break stuff? An example? No, I'm gonna have you guys talk first, and then we'll see. So, like, let's talk about what you guys came up with, or I'll just say design here, because maybe we'll talk about other things. And here, let me. Oops. Here we go. Let's have the preview over here so we can see it in larger. So what, somebody want to talk about what sort of design you came up with, the way to break stuff down, or the components, or what we need?
I would talk about it. I don't know what I'm doing, but.
That's good. All right. Yeah, go ahead.
So my thought was, don't know how to make any of it happen, is we have like a similar count with a render that counts up by ones, and just kind of like you translate it with like an if statement into minutes versus hours, and they're assigned a variable that's something like that, that's sent to another. That's like one thing, the function thing, and then we have a component that divides it up into the way that it should look on the page. Hours, minutes, seconds, and then we'll have like a change state kind of function thing. I'm not sure if I want to change state or whatever, but like maybe just change a variable or something. That would be start versus stop. So, and that will affect the render. The render can't run, the render pauses when this state is stop.
Okay.
And then the render continues adding 1 to time, which is 1. He's adding 1 to it when state is start again. And then for reset, we set the time back to 1 or 0 rather. It would be 0. That's what you
probably should start at 0.
Okay.
Yeah, don't know how to make that happen. That's what I was thinking.
Anybody have a different way they? Oh, sorry. I mean, that's cool. I mean, I think you've captured a lot of the different. It seems like you especially focused on the actions, the state transitions, and state positions, right? Which is great because that's an important aspect of building something that has sort of state, is thinking about how am I going to manage these different transitions. One of the great things about React is sometimes it can make that a lot easier than you might think, which is really cool. And I think as we break this down over, it's probably going to take more than this class. As we break this down, you'll begin to see just how easy React can make some of that state transition logic in terms of how you deal with some of that stuff. So I think that should be, I hope, encouraging or whatever. But did anybody else have a different way you thought about stuff, or your component breakdown in terms of how you think we'd break stuff out?
Had a different approach, which is thinking big picture components or
Sure. Yeah. And so what do you have? All right.
We're not sure if the fourth one should be 1 or 2, but we have the stopwatch, and it's gonna have a display,
Okay.
and then it's gonna have the button to play, which is gonna be the same cost, but we don't know if button should be just button, and then include that, but the reset, play, and stuff, like the actions with them.
Uh-huh.
The button component, or whether those 3 actions should be in some component.
Right. No, it's a good question, right? It's a good challenge. Yeah.
We broke ours down, thinking similarly and kind of having some of the same questions with the time display component and then a start stop button that would toggle whether when you click start, then that same button would be the stop button. And then
Okay.
basically just those 3.
Great. I mean, yeah. No, I don't think there's a wrong. I think there's just different ways of thinking about this and different actions to break down, right? Does anybody have a significantly different approach or something else? Great. I think I think there was a lot of great thoughts here, right? I definitely liked. So we'll probably, and I'm just sort of winging this, right? I don't have it set in stone because I want to think it out with you guys and sort of make the mistakes of design, so you guys can see that that's what happens as you're building something out, as opposed to having this perfectly rehearsed, I've already written all this stuff out tutorial. So yeah, let's think about this. I really like that's sort of pretty close to a combination of these approaches, right? So I like the idea of thinking of a stopwatch like component that's sort of encapsulating it, you know? So this is it may not do much on its own, but it's this maybe just a parent component that's containing other pieces. And then inside of there, we would have the, I don't know what to call it, the timer or the display, time display. I'm just playing with names here. Which is a part of it, right? And I think we've captured that with some of these conversations. And then we have this start. And maybe I would probably do it this way too, start/stop button. So I don't know what to call that button. Maybe just call it start/stop button.
What are these? Start, pause, because there's a difference between stop. Stop is more like,
Yeah,
you don't have the option of starting from when you left.
I like that. It's a good point, right? It really is a pause. And then we have a clear button, right? And one thing that we can already see here is we've got a piece of commonality between some of our components. What do we have that's, even just in the names that we just wrote out, what do we have that's common here? We have a button, right? So we may not get to that right now, but that already begins to imply that we've got a common component that other ones may use or inherit from, or maybe we don't even have to create separate components, but that we've got some sort of, there's a relationship here of some kind, right? Something going on. So then let's continue to think about this a little bit as we're building this out before we start writing some code, right? Is so somewhere we need to store the states, right? The elapsed time or something like that, or count, whatever, however we want to do this. Where do we think that bit? Well, let's see if there's any other state. So let's talk about state. What state? That's not what I wanted. Auto-completed something different. What state do we have in this stopwatch that we're building?
0.
What? We have whether it's started or stopped, right? So I don't know what to call that state. Is started. I don't know. Just is running. I like that. Is running. All right. Now, what other state do we have in this stopwatch? Clear, but is clear actually a state, or is it just something that lets us transition to a state?
Well, I think wouldn't that be like there's like a time object that because it has a value and when you clear and change the value back to the original state.
Right. There's some sort of like elapsed time or counter, or I can go with elapsed time. I mean, I think that's fine, right? Because that's part of our state. Do we have any state anyone can think of?
Yeah, the pause
The pause.
would be the elapsed.
But that might just be able to be used with is running, right? Because if it's,
Okay, yeah.
yeah. So I don't know if there is. I can't think of anything else myself, right? So as like when I'm writing software, I'm doing development. A lot of times this is sort of my process for building something out. Is I'm trying to think about some of these aspects. What components do I have? Especially when I'm building out something with React. And then maybe like what sort of state do I need to track? What and then we can talk about what are our, and this is looking at this whole thing, right? These may go in different places within this stopwatch. So if we're thinking of the stopwatch as just one whole thing, maybe they all go there, but maybe we'll put these in different components. I don't know. So let's talk about the events, the actions for the events, right? So what are the events that we have for our stopwatch? Like, yeah, like start. Perfect. That's an event, right? Pause. That's not right. Ah, man. Pause. Reset. All right. Are there any other events? We might be able to, yeah. We very well might be able to.
Just I was thinking with the idea of doing a render, adding, or rerunning the code that adds to the time and then telling it to not rerun, but stop.
Right.
When is running is I mean, is running as well.
So now, yeah, I mean, that's definitely a way to solve the how are you actually going to display your time changing, right? Or whatever. So now that, you know, if you've thought about stuff like this, I don't know. I think where I would start with any sort of building this out is I would start with creating this stopwatch component, most likely. Now you could, so there's two different approaches to take here for building this out, and neither one of them is right or wrong. When you're just getting started in development, there's at least one approach that's a little easier to start with, and then once you've got a little more experience, I tend to think this a second approach is a little better for React apps. So when you're first getting started, there's sort of the top-down approach of start with this higher level component, like the stopwatch, and start building, and then break things out from that when you need to break out other components and it makes sense, which is a perfectly fine approach. And the reason that that works really well when you're just sort of getting started is because you're starting with the sort of high level thing that you want to show, that you want to display. So you don't have to think about it, how you're putting stuff together just yet. The second approach, which is very common in React development, but requires a little more, you're sort of holding on to other concepts longer before you get them into code, is the idea of if you've broken it down like we did here, where you're like, oh, I've got these lower level components. So the second approach is to start at the lower level and say, okay, well, I'm going to start by creating a button component, and then I'm going to create these, and then I'm going to create a time display, and then I'm going to put them together into a stopwatch. And so either one of those is a completely valid way to approach it. The benefits of starting at the smaller component level is you're probably going to build components that are have a cleaner separation between what they do because you're starting at this small component level. And there's a better chance of you realizing sort of maybe where the reuse is, or building out stuff in an easier way to compose. And the benefits from starting at the top level is you can build out without having to, maybe you haven't figured out what your components are, how you want to break it out into subcomponents. So if you start at a higher level and you're building it out, suddenly you go, oh, this piece makes sense as something separate. You can pull it out at that point and make a separate component. So I was going to say I was going to start at the stopwatch, but I sort of feel ambivalent. Maybe I'll take a quick poll here. People have a preference. Who would prefer if we start at the stopwatch level and we build our way down before we separate out the subcomponents? No opinion? What? Who wants to start with the small, like, individual components, and then we'll sort of build up? All right. We have a preference on which one we want to start with? What? The button? Start with a button? All right, let's do it. So we'll start with a start pause button. So I'll give you like a starting point here so that everyone can maybe see how you would get started. And then what you can do from there is I'll give each team a little bit of time to work on it after I get this started together, and then maybe we'll come back together and try and build out a very basic start pause button together. And I guarantee you, as you guys start working on this, you'll suddenly realize, oh man, there's some things what am I going to do? How do I get some of this in there, right? So let's go with this. Let's just see what we're going to do. Let's start at the app level here. And I'll say, I'm going to, what I want to do first, because I don't have anything else for it to hook up to, is I will just create inside of this source start pause button .js file. I'm going to make it about the most basic version of this that I possibly could to start with, which will just be export default function start pause button, which takes in some props. And for now, I'm just going to return null. And I always like a new line at the end of my files. So that's my, this is the most basic component. It's not really rendering anything in there. I'm just giving a starting place for us. But that way I can, in my app over here, I can import it. From /start pause button .js, and then I can add it to my rendering here. So this should be pretty much the most basic version of adding this start pause button. I don't even have any, it's not actually rendering anything visible right now. So in order to actually even know that it rendered, you could just see that it renders there, but I'll go over here because I have the React Dev Tools installed and I should be able to see it sitting in here, right? Here's my component. So I know I'm rendering it, but it's not putting anything there. If you want it to have a little bit more, just to validate that something's there, you could return like a string to start with. I think this should work. All right, we've got something. You can, but I'm not solving any of that yet. That's for all you guys to start working on. So I'm gonna give you guys, I think this is a reasonable place for you guys to work from. So let's split up into our groups again and try and start building out a start pause button component. So you might start thinking about what props does this how does it accomplish its job, and some of that. And I think there'll be a lot of questions on this really quickly. I don't think we'll get very far. So I'm not going to give you a full 10 minutes because I'll bet people will start asking questions well before then. Let's go about 3 or 4 minutes or something, and then we can come back and start asking questions. Or if people have them a little earlier, try and tackle them if you can a little bit in your group. But if you have questions even earlier, you're just completely stuck, let me know.
Yeah. He created a new file. So, in your SOC, you can open it. Click it. You're gonna create it. You can right click SOC and create a new file. Right, and then you name it like start. Now you gotta put stuff in the file. Just made it a JavaScript file. You have to read it.
Oh, really? Okay. Gotcha.
No slashes. You either want to do camel case, which is this, certain cases where you went lowercase, sometimes minus four, between them, or a dash. Just like that.
No.
So, and then in that file, you're going to a basic.
Yeah, in this one, it's, you're telling it to go get this file. And then you have return. I did return. All that. Okay, so that's all right. This
So you put that in,
put it
and then you want to
into-
go over to
or
app.
this red one. Exactly.
You want to open it? You can just double click it. Okay. And then at the top, you see
No,
how you
whatever you
have,
put here.
import clock right there. So you're gonna do the same thing next time, but you're importing your start, stop button, just like from. Start, stop button.
Got it. All right.
The whole thing, you see, this is the naming function,
So what do we
which is
put
start,
next?
stop button. And this is the name of the file. So in JS, you want to do that. You see, quotation mark.
Yep.
The name of the file, this, you see, clock JS, that's the name of the file, your file is called step clock.
It's just a string. All right, let's do it this way. Yeah, this.
Is that what you named it? Or you started it with a little kid?
Oh.
Okay. Is that what you called your function?
Okay. Yeah, he's, yeah, that's all right.
I was like, okay, so you thought it was starting with lowercase s.
I'm trying to do.
Camel case is uppercase. That's how you do camel case. It's a convention, but that'll work fine.
Okay, now.
No, you, that's not the name of your file, right?
Yeah.
Lowercase s for your file. This is your file.
So we probably want.
All right, how are people doing so far? We stuck? We're moving along?
That
Stuck?
right there is just texture for your screen. This is the name of your file. This is the name of your file.
All right,
This is the name of your file. This
That's
is the
fine.
name of your function.
Is that recorded, are you?
yeah, this is being recorded right now. That's fine, yeah. So did anybody make real progress on this as to where they wanted to go with this? People got stuck pretty early? Yes. Yeah, I can show you that real fast. In the app.js file, I imported it.
But instead of
All right. Well, let's this is good. This is good. All right, let's work on this then collectively. So did anybody get past this point? No? We already have a little bit of an example in our app.js file, right? Oh, they're still moving along over there.
So it's not there. I'm thinking in your start class, make it.
That's okay. I'm testing. So maybe start on
Nothing. It's just telling you what to function. This is telling you what is functional.
running is true. Then I want my button. They stop.
And then save it and then make it everything.
You see what I'm doing? So I'm just testing it.
Yeah, both links here and then
Running. I really want to.
wherever the function. If you want, maybe you should even have an file name, and then you'll be able to tell the difference, right? So you can go over here, start modifying, you just call it,
Yeah.
and start stop. Something different, wherever you want. So save that.
This has nothing to do right now.
And then over here, we need to change this.
Because eventually we're gonna our state of our
You guys are already. I can tell you're already trying to move to the next thing here, right? So let's all come back here and we'll try and work on one of these together. Work on this start pause button a little bit.
yeah, eventually
All right, is everyone with me? We're gonna get started. So I'd say the first thing, right, is we want to display a button. So we already have, and this is me being, watch the laziness start to kick in right away, right? All right, I'm lazy. I don't want to rewrite this, so I'm going to sort of steal this button code that I had there. The first thing I'm going to do is I want to display a button of some kind. So instead of returning a string, I want to return a button. This type button thing is a little bit of a bit of magic. It's tied to HTML. It's not critical to what you're doing right now. But if you have a button inside of a form element in an HTML page, by default, it will submit that form. But if you give it type button, then it won't submit the form. So it's just a safeguard against where this button might go. So if you put it on a page inside of a form, you wouldn't accidentally be submitting a form with this button. And then we want this. All right, well, what's our initial state for this button? We want it to say start, probably, right? And then on click, I don't know exactly what I want to do yet. So I want to build this thing up piece by piece. So I don't know what I want to do when I click yet. So let's get rid of that. And now we should have pretty much the most minimal version of our button as something that looks like a button. Oh, we're going to have a problem. React must be in scope when using JSX. So because this is JSX, it tells me I need to import React in this file. So I'm going to have to go up above my export here and import React. I don't have to have the component thing, but I'm going to leave it there because I know that I want to change this over to a class component, at least temporarily. Then we may come back to being a functional component later. We'll see. But now I've brought that in. So now I've got a button, right? Like, okay, it's cool. It's a button. It says start. Any ideas on what our next step would be for this? So, yeah.
We were sort of working on a prototype where we would pass in property of running to toggle it. So essentially to make it and use a variable as to whether we say start or stop.
Oh, like on click, like on Facebook.
So
Without any on click, it's not any better or anything.
you don't have any on click. You were
Not yet.
okay. Yeah, let's go down that route. So there's a lot of different ways you could go from here, right? We could add an on click handler. We could decide that we want to add state to this and get this start value from state instead of having it just written right there. But yeah, let's try this other approach. So let's say we're going to pass in something. So let's think of it. This gets to one of the principles of trying to think about React components is try to, again, keep as much state isolated as possible and try to have your components not need state until the last moment. Try to use props to drive how your component renders. So that means, okay, we've got a start pause button. So let's say that we want to use a prop to drive how it renders, whether it renders start or whether it renders pause, right? So then what do we want to call that prop? We can call it is running. That's what we were calling our state before, right? In our conversation was is running. So let's just call it is running over here. All right. So one of the interesting things about React is if you pass in, you don't have to say true to pass in a true value for a true or parent. So just by declaring is running here, it's going to have is running as a prop that's value is true. So now if we go over to our, let me move this over here and get rid of my preview here. If we go back to our start pause button, so now we're passing in a prop of some kind that we want to be able to read and change what we display. So how can we do something, change what we display off of a prop that we pass in? This is what? Sounds fine to me, right? You guys have written something like this many times. This is no different than like is legal age or something like that, or is legal age to drive, is legal age to drink. These problems that you did before, right? We're just passing in a value and changing something off of it, right? So let's do let's define a string. Let text equal, and let's give it a default value. It'll just be start. And then what do we want to check against?
So the props is running.
Props.isRunning. Well, I mean, we want the text to be start then, right? So maybe we won't. Let's do this in the most basic fashion, and then we'll simplify it a little bit. So I'm just going to define text here, but not give it a value. So then if we're running, what is our value for, what do we want the button to say? Oh, you're right.
Stop. Yeah, stop.
We want it to say pause, right? Otherwise, we want it to say what? So if it's not running, we want the button to say what? Start. All right. And then how can we use that variable inside of our JSX down here? What do you do when you want to put some JavaScript in the middle of JSX? Curly braces.
There we go.
So we just say text, right? All right, so we can test this sort of statically now. If we go over to our app, let's save this with is running on it. And what we see is our button says pause, which is cool. So now let's try it without it and see what happens. And our button says start. Yeah. Yeah. I'll be posting this branch of the code for everybody to work off of tonight, so, or tomorrow at the latest.
Should we do something that changes is running?
Well, the interesting thing is, this gets to some of the value of dealing with React components, right? Is at this point in time, this start pause button is still very, very simple. And so if you wanted to test all of the different states that it could get in, you don't have to change anything inside of this component directly to do that. You can just render it with different props and get it into every possible state. So it doesn't have any complex internal logic where it's like, oh, I need to render my component and have it here and then change a value and then do this. Like, we could test every one of these really easily. So, you know, just for the heck of it, let's go over here. I'm gonna put a break here just to give me a new line. And I'm just gonna render a second instance of it. And I know, since I know those are that's my only prop, and those are my two possible states, I can see both possible states of my component right there, right? It makes it really easy when your component doesn't have any internal state. It's really easy to reason about how can I test all of the different versions of this component. Just change the props you pass in and it renders it, and there you go. So it's really, really easy to test components that don't have state. That's one of the beautiful aspects of some of them. So if we have that, and this is a different direction than I planned on going, but now we can sort of do this, and I'm going to clean up this code a little bit. I'm going to write it out a little differently than you guys might. This is more like the way I would probably write it. So what I was getting at before is I would say let text equal, and then I would just get rid of this else condition entirely if I was doing this myself. And you don't have to have written it this way. This is just showing you, some of my thinking is because, all right, the default is start, and if it's running, it shows pause, but otherwise it'll be start. So it's sort of getting rid of the else branch by just making it the default value. Again, the great part is it's trivial for me to test that change because I don't have any complex state in here to test. I can just test these two possible values for it and see that it works, which is really, really nice aspect of working with components that don't have internal state. So where do we want to go next? We know that this component can render itself in two different states. What's the next step that we need to be able to do for this button?
Well, I guess it would need to change the timer so we don't.
We need to connect it to a timer, or we just need it to do something when you click it. And let's say, what? Right. And maybe it's not going to be connected to the timer yet, but this is a button. So we can change something elsewhere when we click this button, right? So there's a couple ways we could handle this. The cleanest way for the button is to not hold any state internally to it, right? And we can talk about what that looks like, but I'm gonna write it out sort of in a more complex way and then build towards this cleaner version first. So I'm gonna sort of take this button and say, okay, well now I wanna make this guy sort of self-contained so that this whole app doesn't have all this logic in it. I don't want the app to have all the complex start pause logic in it because it doesn't belong at the app level. It belongs probably somewhere else. So this will go a little faster because this isn't the final state that we would end up in. But I'll move it along a little bit, right? So what I would actually do, like, I probably wouldn't do this. I would think through this, but this is a way to think about evolving stuff. And it's really useful when you're sort of learning React. Let's do a class. I'm sort of going to replace what I have up here and turn it into a class. And if you remember, we actually learned how to do that. We could do it by saying class start pause button extends component. I'll get rid of this props bit right here. And then we learned you create a render method, and that can take props. Or actually, render doesn't take props. Render is just like this. Let me make this a proper method so it closes itself. And then we change our props when we are using a class-based component. How are our props different? This dot, because they're inside of our instance, our object that we're using. And now I'm going to export down here. You could export it inline, I think. I just don't do that very often. So export the default start pause button. And let me see if this works. I don't know if we will. Not yet, because we don't have anything besides this render. And so we don't have to define that because this is really still something that could have been a functional component. It doesn't have to be a class component. All right, so we know the pause is working. Checking our other state is trivial. So we'll just test that. So it looks like we're fine in terms of our transition from a functional component to a class component, right? So we made the change. We took it from functional to class, and that's the way that you would transition something like that. But now what we want to do is let's go ahead and add in some internal state. So it takes in props. And this dot super. So I don't even think I care about the props coming into this at all right now. So this dot super. And then I do want to do this dot state. And the reason I'm doing this is because what I'm going to do is move. You'll see that I'll actually turn this back into a functional component, but I'm just pulling all of this state complexity into our button for the time being. So it's going to manage the state of whether it's start or paused. So I'm going to move this in here. So it is running as false right now. So it's on our state now instead of something that we're going to pass in. So if I want to change this so I'm not looking for a prop, I want to get this off state, what change do I make?
This dot state.
This dot state is running. All right, let's see if this works. Oh, this is not allowed before super. Oh, it's not this dot super, it's just super. That's what I mean. All right, let's try. We've got start, and now instead of a property I pass in, I'll change my state value, and it says pause. So we know that we can get it rendered to the two different states. But one of the interesting things here is if you were trying to test this to verify the different states this could get in, it would be really hard to write, like, I can't write two different start pause buttons like I did before. They can easily test those two states because now that state is inside of that button, right? So it's harder, by adding state to it, we made it harder for us to test the different states that it can get into because it's an internal thing. And so we have to have some hook in order to change that state. So for a button, how does a button trigger? What's the event handler that you might use? On click. right? So we're gonna want some sort of on click, do something on click. All right. And since I moved all of this internal to my my component here, the on click is going to be a method on our start pause button. I'm just going to call it on click itself. Then I'm going to go ahead and implement it right here. And the minute I write this inside of my on click, we should all realize that I need a magic string up in my constructor for it. This dot on click equals this dot on click dot bind to this. And so what do we want to do when we click the button? Change it from true and false, right? So how do we change our state? This dot set state. And in this case, we can just do the simple version of set state, which just takes an object. And what state do we want to change? Is running. And what do we want it to be? We want to set it to false. All right. So let's see what happens here. Now I've got an on click inside of it, and it's managing some state. Oh, hold on. I want, let's start it as false, and then we want to set it to true. So we're not running initially. So let's see what happens. Oh, it went to pause. We got a problem. What's our problem? Won't go back. All right. So how do we change our on click so that it can go back? Yeah.
At some point, I think we had some code up that was look up the previous state and then do the opposite.
Yeah, that's it. That's a common trick when it's called toggling. So this is the negation operator, right? So negate this dot state dot is running. So it's going to value this dot state dot is running and return the negative of it, which means it should toggle it every time that you click it. Let's test this out. All right, we got a nice button toggling back and forth, right? So that's sort of the first thing that we needed. It's good progress, I'd say. Any thoughts on this so far? Like concerns, thoughts about it? Where do we go from here? All right. So I think the next step for us, I think I might actually leave it in this state. This is the state we're going to have for, this is pretty much the state for the end of today. In terms of where we'll get, I don't think I may actually implement the next one. We'll see. But what do we want to do next out of our, I mean, I know what I want to do, and that's probably what we'll work on, but let's see if people have a different opinion. What do you think we should do next? So if we have these other components, let's say these are the components we want to build. We have start pause button. What do we think is the next one we should tackle here? There's not a right answer to this. Vanna, you have a thought? What? Clear? I like that. You know why I like it? Because I just did a button, so it should be easier than doing something different, right? All right, so let's try and tackle the clear button as our next step. We might notice some interesting challenges or notice commonalities early on, but let's do that next. So let's sort of go down the same path that we did before. Create a very basic component, a clear button right here in our source folder. It'll be like the start pause button that we had, you know, clearbutton.js, and we'll make it just the most basic version. Export default function clear button, which takes some props and returns. I'll get back to that in just a second. So if we did our clear button here, and we have it over there, very, very simple, not doing anything. So in app.js, let's add that just like we did our start pause button. So the first thing we need to do is import it. Clear button from, and then you give it the file, the path to it, and / is a way of saying here in this exact same folder is clearbutton.js. And then we can go ahead and add it in down there. And we can go over here and take a look. Oh, we've got a clear button. We've got some text there, but we haven't written any of the code in it. So let's go ahead and split off into our groups and try and write out the code for our clear button. And this is probably as far as we're going to make it. I don't want to hold people to the very end, so you can work in groups for the rest of the class towards this clear button goal. I think this right here, where we're at, will probably be the starting point. So this will be the lesson 2 tag where everyone will start from. And then we will probably build off of this in the next class, getting the clear button implemented and hopefully the, what did I call it? I don't even remember what I called stuff. The time display as well, and maybe the stopwatch, and sort of build up from there. Yes. So yeah, if people, if you need to go, you can feel free, but I encourage you to stay in your group, try and talk through this. There'll be some interesting challenges with the clear button that hopefully very quickly you get a problem with it, but anyone, just one moment. I just want to make sure I end my, anyone watching online, I'm going to go ahead and end the stream now. So yeah, just work on this and we'll use this as our starting point for the next class. All right.